August 29th, 1945. Midland, Texas. The dust hung in the air like suspended time as the Army transport truck rolled to a stop outside the ranch gates. The engine ticked in the heat. A cowboy removed his hat, squinting through the glare. When the truck bed opened, what stepped out wasn't what any of them expected. A girl, barely tall enough to reach a grown man's shoulder, descended barefoot onto Texas soil. Her uniform sagged around a frame so thin the wind seemed to move through her rather than against her. 68 pounds. The medic would record that number twice, unable to believe his own scale. Before we continue, if this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We're bringing you true stories that history tried to bury, and your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. Let's make sure this one isn't forgotten. The girl's name was Kiyomi. She stood there, barefoot and silent, staring at men who had been told she was the enemy. They stared back at a child who looked like she'd been carved from air. One cowboy turned to his companion and whispered words that would echo through the bunkhouse for weeks. They told us we were guarding prisoners of war. That ain't no soldier, that's a ghost. And in that moment, standing between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other, Kiyomi realized something that would reshape everything she thought she knew. The monsters she'd been warned about were handing her a blanket. 3 months earlier, the world had fractured. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled across Japanese radio waves for the first time in history. His words, delivered in formal court language most citizens couldn't fully understand, carried a message that shattered an empire. Japan had surrendered. For girls like Kiyomi, who had spent years serving in military field hospitals as Kenrohoshi volunteer labor corps, the announcement arrived like a death sentence. They had been taught that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that American soldiers would do unspeakable things to captured women, that survival as a prisoner was not survival at all, but a living hell that would strip them of dignity, family, and soul. Kiyomi had believed every word. She was 15 years old, born in Nagoya in 1930, and had known war longer than she'd known peace. Her father died when his transport ship was torpedoed in 1942. Her older brother vanished into the army and never wrote home. Her mother boiled weeds to make soup and told Kiyomi that sacrifice was the highest form of love. When Kiyomi was recruited at 13 to work in a military field hospital, it wasn't presented as a choice. It was an honor. She scrubbed floors slick with blood. She carried buckets of water that weighed more than her malnourished arms could bear. She folded bandages stained beyond washing and watched boys her brother's age die in silence, their last words whispered to a ceiling that offered no comfort. The instructors handed out pamphlets alongside ration cubes. The pamphlets showed illustrations of American soldiers hulking, animalistic figures towering over cowering Japanese women. The captions described torture, humiliation, death. One image Kiyomi never forgot showed a young woman kneeling, head bowed, surrounded by leering captors. The text beneath read, "Better to die with honor than live with shame." She believed it. They all did. When the bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nurses wept in corners where the officers couldn't see. When the Emperor's voice finally came through the static, one of the older women tried to bite through her own tongue rather than face capture. Kiyomi didn't try to die. She simply went numb. She was herded onto a truck with other girls, then onto a ship bound for America. The voyage across the Pacific took weeks. Below deck, the girls whispered rumors. One said Americans fed prisoners to wild animals. Another claimed they were being taken to factories to work until they collapsed. Kiyomi said nothing. She sat on her bunk and counted the rivets in the ceiling, waiting for the horror to begin. But when the ship docked in San Francisco, there were no torture chambers. Only more trucks, more clipboards, more men in uniform who didn't shout or strike. They were processed, examined by medics who handled them with a gentleness that felt like mockery. Then they were sorted. Some went to camps in California, others to work programs in the Midwest. Kiyomi and 11 other girls were loaded onto a train heading south. Texas. The word meant nothing to her. When they arrived, the landscape was alien. Flat, endless, scorched by a sun that felt different from the one that had burned over Nagoya. The ranch where they were taken wasn't a prison. It was a working cattle operation that had been contracted to house low-risk prisoners of war while they awaited repatriation. The ranchers' weathered men, who spent more time with horses than people, had been told to expect dangerous enemy combatants. What arrived instead were girls who looked like strong wind might scatter them. The foreman stood with his arms crossed, watching them file off the truck. His name was Earl, and he'd served in the Pacific Theater before a leg wound sent him home. He expected to feel anger, maybe even hatred. Instead, he felt something closer to shame. Kiyomi stepped down last. Her bare feet touched the dirt, and she flinched at the heat. A medic approached, crouching to her level, and gestured toward a nearby barn that had been converted into a makeshift clinic. She followed without resistance. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of hay and old wood. The medic, a young man named Robert, who'd been a veterinarian before the war, guided her to a scale. She stepped on. The needle swung, hesitated, settled. 68 pounds. Robert checked the calibration, then checked again. He looked up at Earl, who had followed them inside. Earl removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "What the hell did they do to her?" Robert examined her arms, her legs, her ribs visible through the fabric of her uniform like the keys of a xylophone. He offered her water. She drank it mechanically, as though the act of swallowing required conscious effort. Her eyes didn't track movement. They stared past him, past Earl, past the barn walls, into some middle distance where nothing could reach her. Robert wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. It dwarfed her, pooling around her feet. She didn't acknowledge it. She simply sat, a structure of bone and silence, while the two men exchanged looks that carried no words but said everything. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. This wasn't war. This was the aftermath, the wreckage, the cost, written in a girl's hollow frame. That first night, Kiyomi was led to a corner of the barn where a bed had been prepared. Not a cot, not a pallet on concrete, but an actual bed hay covered with clean blankets, a pillow that smelled faintly of lavender. She stood before it for a full minute, unmoving, as though waiting for permission or punishment. One of the ranch hands, a man named Hector, who spoke broken Spanish and even less English, gestured for her to lie down. She obeyed. The blanket settled over her like a weight she couldn't interpret. She stared at the rafters, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, horses shifting in their stalls, the low murmur of men talking outside, the crackle of a distant fire. No air raid sirens, no screams, no orders barked in the dark. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Sleep required trust, and trust had been burned out of her in a field hospital where the only certainty was suffering. But she lay there, motionless, feeling the blanket's warmth against her skin, and something inside her, something small and buried, stirred. Not hope, not yet, but a question. Why would they give her this? Around 3 in the morning, the barn door creaked. Kiyomi's eyes snapped open, though she hadn't closed them. A figure entered, silhouetted against the moonlight. Her breath stopped. This was it. The moment they'd warned her about, but the figure didn't approach. It moved to the small stove in the corner, stirred something in a pot, and ladled it into a tin cup. Steam rose, curling in the silver light. The man it was Hector walked slowly toward her and set the cup on the ground beside her bed. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once and left. Kiyomi stared at the cup. The smell hit her before logic could intervene. Broth, rich, salty, thick with fat and vegetables. Her stomach clenched, not with nausea, but with a hunger so violent it felt like rage. She reached for the cup with shaking hands, brought it to her lips, and drank. The heat scalded her tongue. The salt made her eyes water. The fat coated her throat, and for a moment she thought she might vomit, but she didn't. She drank it all, every drop, and then sat there holding the empty cup like it was evidence of something she couldn't name. Kindness. That's what it was. And it terrified her more than any threat ever had. Because if the enemy could be kind, then everything she'd been taught was a lie. And if everything she'd been taught was a lie, then who was she? The days began to blur into routine, though routine was a luxury Kiyomi had forgotten existed. Each morning someone brought her food. Eggs, bread, sometimes bacon that glistened with grease and smelled like a memory from another life. She ate slowly, mechanically, her body relearning what hunger felt like when it could be satisfied. One of the cowboys, a man named Tom with sun-scarred hands and a voice like gravel, showed her how to feed the chickens. He handed her a burlap sack of grain and gestured toward the coop. She followed, unsure, and scattered the feed as he demonstrated. The chickens swarmed, pecking and clucking, indifferent to war or nationality. Tom nodded approval and walked away, leaving her alone with the birds. It became her task. Every morning she fed the chickens. Every afternoon she collected eggs, cradling them in her apron like fragile truths. The work was simple, but it was hers. No one shouted. No one struck her. No one called her useless or a burden. They simply let her exist, and in that existence something began to shift. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of copper and violet, she heard music. A banjo, plucked with careless joy, drifted from the bunkhouse. Then a harmonica joined in, wheezing and bright. Laughter followed, unguarded and loud, the kind of laughter that belonged to men who weren't afraid. Kiyomi sat outside the barn, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and listened. She didn't understand the melody. She didn't know the words they sang, but she felt the rhythm in her chest, and it made her want to cry. 2 weeks in, a sergeant approached her with a pencil and a scrap of paper. "Write home," he said in slow, careful English. She stared at him, uncomprehending. He mimed writing, then pointed at her, then at the paper. Understanding dawned. They were allowing her to write to her mother. Allowing, not forcing, not censoring, allowing. She took the pencil and paper and sat with them for an hour, paralyzed. What could she say? That she was alive? That the Americans were feeding her? That she'd laughed at a harmonica? Every truth felt like treason. Finally, she wrote 2 words, "I'm safe." She folded the paper and handed it back. The sergeant nodded and walked away. Kiyomi sat there, trembling, because those 2 words had just redefined her entire understanding of survival. The letter made it across the Pacific, passing through sensors and channels, until it reached a desk in Tokyo. A clerk unfolded it, read the 2 words, and frowned. This was not the narrative they'd built. Prisoners were supposed to suffer. They were supposed to confirm the propaganda. This girl's safety was an inconvenience, a crack in the story they'd told to justify everything. The letter was filed away, marked as an anomaly, but its existence lingered. Because if one girl was safe, how many others were? And if the enemy wasn't the monster they'd claimed, what did that make the empire that had sent children to die? Back in Texas, Kiyomi's world continued to expand in small, startling ways. A cowboy gave her a bar of soap-reel soap, thick and yellow, that lathered into clouds of white foam. She washed her hair for the first time in months and stood in the sun, feeling the water drip from the ends like a baptism. Another man, older, with a limp and kind eyes, handed her a pair of socks. Clean, thick, warm. She wore them to bed and cried into her pillow, where no one could hear. A child from the ranch house, a girl no older than 8, ran up to her one morning and pressed a pink ribbon into her hand. "For you," she said in English, grinning, before skipping away. Kiyomi tied the ribbon into her hair and wore it like a flag. Not all the other girls understood. Some turned away, muttering that it was shameful to accept gifts from the enemy. But Kiyomi didn't care. She was tired of shame. She was tired of silence. She looked at herself in a scrap of mirror someone had left in the barn and saw, for the first time in years, not a tool or a shadow, but a girl. The medic weighed her again in late September. 82 pounds. He wrote it down with a small smile. "You're doing good," he said, though she didn't understand the words. She understood the tone. By October, she was 90 pounds. By November 98, her cheeks filled out. Her ribs stopped jutting. Her hands stopped shaking when she held a cup. One cool evening in early December, the Cowboys built a fire outside the barn and invited the girls to join them. Kiyomi sat with her blanket wrapped tight, watching the flames dance. One of the men shuffled a deck of cards and tried to teach them a game, using gestures and broken phrases. She didn't understand the rules, but she tried. She played a card. Someone laughed. Not at her, with her. The distinction mattered. Then someone handed her the harmonica. She hesitated, brought it to her lips, and blew. The sound was terrible, sharp and wrong. Everyone laughed, including her. The sound escaped before she could stop at a bright, startled laugh that felt like rebellion. She clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide, but the damage was done. She had laughed, and the world hadn't ended. That night, lying on her bed with the ribbon still in her hair, Kiyomi asked herself a question she'd been avoiding. If the enemy valued her life enough to feed her, clothe her, teach her, laugh with her, what did that say about the country that had told her she was expendable? The question had no easy answer, but it planted itself in her mind and grew roots. In mid-December the notice came. Repatriation. She would be going home. The medic weighed her one last time. 102 pounds. He smiled and wrote it down like a victory. She was issued a new coat, heavy and warm, a pair of glasses fitted carefully, because she'd admitted she couldn't see clearly. The world sharpened. Faces became distinct. She blinked, overwhelmed by detail she'd lived without for years. She packed her small bundle, the diary she'd been given, filled with uneven handwriting, the ribbon faded but precious, the pencil worn to a nub, and folded into her coat pocket a letter from Tom, written in careful English. I hope you remember Texas kindly. You're tougher than you look. She read it 3 times, memorizing every word. On the morning of departure, the cowboys lined up by the gate. No speeches, no ceremonies. Just hats tipped low, one by one. Kiyomi stopped, turned, and bowed. Not in submission, in gratitude. Then she climbed into the truck and didn't look back. The ship that carried her home felt different. From the deck she watched Texas fade and opened her diary. One line stopped her. I do not understand this war anymore. She didn't cross it out. It was true. Japan's port was broken and subdued. Buildings leaned. Faces were thin. Stepping onto familiar soil, she touched the ribbon in her hair, and the diary and her coat anchors reminding her that dignity is something you carry, not something granted. She would never forget the ranch, the warm barn, banjo nights, bacon, soap, laughter that felt like treason. She arrived weighing 68 pounds. She left carrying proof that humanity survives when someone chooses to see a person, not an enemy.